Tae-ho Kim pulled his thick jacket closer as the Antarctic wind howled across the research station, and the ice beneath his feet creaked with each step he took toward the main building, where his team waited with coffee and data that needed his attention. The morning had started like any other at the South Pole Research Facility, but the radio chatter from the communications room told him something big was happening in the world beyond their frozen home, and he quickened his pace to find out what was causing such excitement among his colleagues who rarely got worked up about anything except their ice core samples and weather patterns. Hyojin Park sat at her desk, surrounded by screens that showed signals she had never seen before, and her hands moved quickly across the keyboard as she tried to make sense of the transmissions that were coming from somewhere beyond Earth's atmosphere. The signals were organized and complex and definitely not natural phenomena, like solar flares or cosmic radiation, and her military training told her that someone or something was trying to communicate, but the patterns made no sense according to any human language or code she knew. She had been monitoring space communications for 5 years and had never encountered anything like this, and the realization that these might be alien signals made her heart race with both excitement and fear. Woo Bin Lee stood in the emergency meeting room at the United Nations building in New York and watched as world leaders argued about how to respond to the strange objects that satellites had detected approaching Earth and his experience as both a North Korean defector and current. Security advisor gave him a unique perspective on how governments reacted when faced with the unknown. The objects were massive and clearly artificial and moving in formations that suggested intelligence and purpose, and every nation wanted to either shoot first or try to communicate, but nobody could agree on which approach would keep humanity safe. He had lived through enough conflicts to know that fear made people do stupid things, and right now, fear was the only thing he could see in the room. So Young Choi knelt beside the ice drilling equipment and carefully extracted another core sample from deep within the Antarctic ice sheet, and her years as a climatologist had taught her to read the layers of frozen history like pages in a book. But today, something was different about the samples she was pulling from the deepest levels they had ever reached. The ice was older than anything she had studied before and contained tiny particles that did not match any known elements or compounds, and under her microscope she could see structures that looked almost organic, but followed patterns that made no scientific sense according to everything she knew about Earth's geological history. The first alien ships appeared in Earth's sky 3 hours after Hyejin had detected their signals, and they were enormous triangular vessels that moved without sound and cast shadows over entire cities as they positioned themselves above major population centers around the world. People stopped their daily routines and stared upward at the impossible sight, and some ran in panic while others stood frozen in wonder, and governments scrambled to establish contact while military forces prepared for the worst possible scenario. The ships remained silent for exactly 1 hour, and then they began to transmit a message in dozens of human languages that had clearly been learned from intercepted Earth communications. Admiral Vextar of the Catherian Empire stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked down at the blue planet that intelligence reports had described as a backwater world populated by primitive creatures who had barely managed to leave their own atmosphere. His species had conquered hundreds of worlds using the same simple formula of overwhelming technological superiority, followed by demands for surrender, and most civilizations submitted without significant resistance once they understood how outmatched they were. This mission was supposed to be routine and easy, and would add another world to the Dominion's growing empire and provide new resources and workers for the galactic economy that always needed fresh planets to exploit. The alien message was simple and direct and left no room for misunderstanding as it echoed from every radio and television and communication device on Earth at the same time and in perfect human languages that somehow included regional accents and cultural references that showed these beings had been studying humanity for some time. They identified themselves as representatives of the Galactic Dominion and explained that Earth had been selected for integration into their empire and that resistance would be futile and harmful to human survival, and that compliance would ensure continued existence under their protection and guidance. They gave humanity 12 hours to surrender all military forces and government control to their representatives who would arrive to begin the transition process. Tae-ho reached the communications room just as the alien message ended and found his team gathered around Hyejin's equipment with expressions of shock and disbelief and fear and wonder all mixed together on their faces. The research station was thousands of miles from any major city or military installation and seemed like the safest place on Earth to weather whatever was about to happen. But Tae-ho knew that their isolation could also become a trap if the aliens decided that even remote facilities needed to be controlled or destroyed. He looked at his team and saw the same thoughts in their eyes and realized that their peaceful scientific mission had suddenly become something much more dangerous and uncertain. Military installations around the world began reporting attacks, exactly 6 hours after the surrender deadline, as alien ships descended from orbit and targeted defense systems with weapons that made nuclear arsenals look like toys from a previous century. The attacks were precise and surgical and designed to cripple Earth's ability to fight back rather than cause maximum casualties, and this restraint suggested that the aliens wanted humanity alive and functional rather than extinct. Fighter jets that tried to intercept the alien craft were simply disabled rather than destroyed, and their pilots found themselves safely on the ground with their weapons systems mysteriously shut down and their engines dead but their lives intact. Wu Bin watched the reports coming in from around the world and recognized the tactics of an enemy that was confident in their superiority and wanted to demonstrate their power without wasting resources on unnecessary destruction. The aliens were treating this like a police action rather than a war, and their restraint might seem merciful, but he knew it actually made them more dangerous because it showed they had enough power to be gentle while still being completely unstoppable. He had seen similar tactics used by overwhelming forces throughout history and knew that resistance would be difficult when the enemy could afford to be careful and precise rather than brutal and desperate. The first major surprise came when the aliens began targeting the polar regions with orbital bombardment that seemed to serve no military purpose, since the ice caps contained no significant human populations or strategic installations. The weapon strikes were different from the surgical attacks on military bases, and instead seemed designed to generate massive amounts of heat that would melt enormous sections of ice in very short periods of time. So Young watched in horror from her research station as glaciers that had existed for millions of years began collapsing into the ocean at a rate that defied every climate model she had ever studied, and the implications for global sea levels and weather patterns were catastrophic. Tae-ho felt the ground shake beneath the research station as another orbital strike hit the ice shelf several kilometers away, and the sound of cracking ice filled the air like thunder that would not stop. His team began emergency procedures to secure their equipment and data, but he found himself drawn to the windows where he could see the ancient ice beginning to break apart and slide toward the ocean in massive chunks that looked like floating mountains. The aliens were melting the poles for reasons that made no sense from a military perspective, and as he watched the destruction, he began to wonder if there was something hidden in the ice that they wanted to reach, or something they wanted to release. Jin Woo Nam stood knee-deep in the newly formed meltwater pools and watched creatures emerge from the ice that should not have existed on Earth, and his training as a marine biologist told him that what he was seeing violated every rule of evolution and taxonomy he had ever learned. The organisms were unlike anything in any database or textbook, and they moved with purpose and intelligence that suggested they were not random products of natural selection, but something that had been designed or engineered for specific functions. Some looked like crystalline jellyfish that pulsed with internal light, while others resembled metallic plants that grew and changed shape as he watched, and all of them seemed to be responding to human presence in ways that suggested recognition rather than simple reaction to stimuli. Mira Song crouched behind the ruins of a destroyed military outpost and watched alien patrol craft sweep across the landscape while she coordinated resistance cells through encrypted radio channels that somehow still worked despite the enemy's technological superiority. Her special forces training had prepared her for asymmetric warfare against overwhelming odds, but nothing had prepared her for the strange changes she was experiencing in her own body and mind as the days passed since the invasion began. Her reflexes were faster than they had ever been, and her night vision was improving beyond normal human limits, and sometimes she could sense the alien craft approaching before they appeared on any scanner or detection device her team possessed. Dong-Hyun Kang worked frantically in his underground workshop to reverse engineer pieces of alien technology that resistance fighters had recovered from crashed scout ships, and his engineering background helped him understand the basic principles behind their energy systems and propulsion methods. The alien technology was incredibly advanced, but it followed logical patterns that human science could eventually comprehend and adapt, and he had already managed to create crude copies of their power cells and communication devices. What puzzled him most was how easily the technology seemed to interface with human operators, and sometimes he felt like the devices were trying to teach him how to use them rather than requiring him to figure out their functions through trial and error. Yejin Lim documented the rapid physiological changes occurring in humans around the world, and her medical research revealed patterns that defied conventional understanding of human biology and genetics. People who had been exposed to the melted, polar ice or the strange organisms emerging from it were developing enhanced physical and mental capabilities at a rate that should have been impossible according to normal evolutionary processes. Enhanced muscle density and bone strength, and improved neural connectivity and expanded sensory perception were appearing in subjects within days or weeks rather than generations, and the changes seemed to be triggered by something in the ice, rather than caused by radiation or chemical exposure from the alien attacks. The resistance fighters who had spent time near the melting ice caps began reporting abilities that their commanding officers initially dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations or exaggerated claims designed to boost morale. Soldiers claimed they could see in complete darkness and hear enemy movements from impossible distances and react to threats before their conscious minds had processed the danger, and some even reported that they could understand alien communications without translation. Equipment. Mira experienced these changes herself and realized that her team was becoming something more than human and that the transformation was spreading to anyone who came into contact with the ancient ice or the creatures that emerged from it. Admiral Vextar reviewed the latest reports from his science officers and felt a growing sense of unease that contradicted everything his intelligence briefings had told him about this primitive world and its inhabitants. The orbital bombardment of the polar regions had been intended as a demonstration of power and a way to eliminate any hidden military installations that might have been concealed under the ice, but instead it had triggered environmental changes that were affecting the human population in ways that made no scientific sense. His advisors had assured him that melting the ice would cause flooding and climate disruption that would weaken human resistance, but instead, it seemed to be strengthening them in ways that violated every principle of xenobiology his species had discovered. The creatures emerging from the melted ice began to seek out human contact and established symbiotic relationships that enhanced human capabilities while apparently gaining something from the interaction that Yejin could not identify through any conventional medical testing. The organisms would attach themselves to human volunteers and integrate with their nervous systems and circulatory systems without causing harm or disease, and instead providing enhanced strength and speed and mental clarity that allowed humans to operate alien technology with increasing skill. The relationship appeared to be mutually beneficial and voluntary, and the organisms seemed to be specifically designed to work with human biology rather than being random parasites or invasive species. Dong-hyun made a breakthrough when he realized that the alien technology was not just advanced engineering, but contained biological components that were designed to interface with living nervous systems rather than purely mechanical control systems. The discovery explained why human operators were becoming more effective with alien equipment over time and why the devices seemed to respond more readily to humans who had been exposed to the ice organisms. The technology was built to work with biological operators, and humans were apparently compatible with the interfaces in ways that suggested either incredible coincidence or deliberate design that predated human civilization by millions of years. Taeho evacuated his research station as the ice shelf continued to collapse, but not before his team recovered ice core samples that contained genetic material unlike anything in Earth's fossil record. The DNA sequences were complex and sophisticated, and contained information that seemed to be encrypted or compressed in ways that required advanced biotechnology to decode and understand. So Young worked with geneticists around the world to analyze the samples and discovered that the genetic material was not entirely alien, but contained markers and sequences that were related to human DNA while being far more complex and complete than anything found in modern human genetics. The first major resistance victory came when Mira's enhanced team managed to capture an intact alien patrol craft by using their improved reflexes and sensory abilities to coordinate an ambush that overwhelmed the crew before they could react or call for reinforcement. The captured aliens were not killed but restrained and interrogated, and their responses revealed that they had never encountered humans with capabilities beyond normal baseline parameters and were confused and frightened by the rapid changes they were observing in human populations. The aliens had expected to face a primitive species with limited technology and predictable biological limitations, but instead found themselves fighting an enemy that was evolving in real time. Jinwoo established communication protocols with the ice organisms and discovered that they possessed a form of collective intelligence that allowed them to share information and coordinate activities across vast distances without any technological interface. The organisms could remember events and information from millions of years ago, and their memories contained data about Earth's history that contradicted everything human science had established about the planet's geological and biological development. According to the organisms, Earth had been inhabited by an advanced civilization long before current human history began, and that civilization had been deliberately hidden or erased from the geological record through methods that the organisms did not fully understand. The alien fleet began repositioning itself as reports reached Admiral Vexitar that human resistance was becoming more effective and organized, and that captured alien personnel were reporting encounters with humans who possessed abilities that exceeded normal species parameters. His military advisors recommended increasing the intensity of the bombardment and targeting civilian populations to break human morale. But something in the ancient archives his science officers had recovered from the ice made him hesitate to escalate the conflict. The archives contained references to Earth as a restricted world and warnings about awakening something that had been deliberately contained, and the timing of the polar bombardment and the subsequent human enhancement suggested that his forces might have triggered something that was beyond their ability to control. Yejin's research revealed that the genetic changes in enhanced humans were not random mutations, but the activation of dormant genetic sequences that had been present in human DNA all along, but had been suppressed or blocked by unknown mechanisms. The ice organisms seemed to be providing the key or catalyst that unlocked these hidden genetic programs and allowed humans to access capabilities that had been part of their biological heritage but had been inaccessible for thousands of generations. The implications suggested that modern humans were not the original or complete version of their species, but rather a diminished or restricted form that was now being restored to its intended state. Hyun-Soo Yu brushed away centuries of ice and dirt from the stone surface that his archaeological team had discovered beneath the Antarctic Research Station, and the symbols carved into the ancient material were unlike any human writing system he had ever studied, but somehow he could understand their meaning as if the knowledge was emerging from deep within his own memory. The ruins extended far deeper into the ice than any human civilization should have existed, and the architectural style was both alien and familiar, and suggested a level of technological sophistication that exceeded current human capabilities, while following design principles that felt inherently human in their approach and aesthetic sensibility. Yoon Jung-seo flew her fighter jet through maneuvers that should have been impossible for both human physiology and aircraft engineering, but her enhanced reflexes and intuitive understanding of the captured alien propulsion systems allowed her to push beyond the normal limits of speed and acceleration and gravitational stress. The alien craft she piloted responded to her thoughts and intentions as much as her physical controls, and sometimes she felt like the ship was an extension of her own body rather than a separate machine she was operating. Her squadron of enhanced pilots had become the most effective fighting force in the human resistance, and their success rate against alien patrol craft was approaching 100%. Sang-min-oh sat across from the captured Kytherian officer and attempted to establish diplomatic communication using translation protocols that combined human linguistic analysis with the enhanced cognitive abilities that had developed since his exposure to the ice organisms. The alien was clearly frightened and confused by the rapid changes occurring in human capabilities and kept referring to ancient protocols and restricted worlds and quarantine measures that suggested Earth had a history that human civilization had never known or remembered. The alien's responses became more cooperative when Sang-min began to speak, using linguistic patterns that seemed to emerge from genetic memory rather than learned human languages. Ju Young-han was only 12 years old, but her psychic abilities had manifested more strongly than those of any adult in the enhanced human population, and she could communicate directly with the ice organisms and access memories and information that predated human recorded history by millions of years. Her parents had been among the first researchers to study the creatures emerging from the melted ice, and her exposure to them had begun before birth, which seemed to allow her to achieve deeper integration and access to capabilities that older humans could only partially develop. Through her connection to the collective consciousness of the organisms, she could see fragments of Earth's true history. The ancient ruins that archaeological teams discovered beneath the ice revealed a civilization that had achieved interstellar travel and genetic engineering and energy manipulation technologies that made current alien capabilities seem primitive by comparison. The architecture incorporated living materials that could reshape themselves according to need, and environmental conditions and power systems that drew energy from quantum fluctuations in space itself and transportation networks that could move people and materials across galactic distances without traditional spacecraft. Hyun-soo realized that humanity was not discovering alien technology, but was rediscovering their own lost heritage and abilities. Admiral Vextar accessed the restricted archives that were normally available only to the highest levels of Galactic Command and found references to the Terran Primarchs, who had once been the most feared warrior species in the galaxy, before they had been defeated and exiled to a remote world where their memories and abilities would be suppressed until they forgot their own nature and became harmless primitives. The archives contained warnings that the quarantine must never be broken, and that awakening the Terrans would threaten the stability of the entire galactic order that had been established after their exile. His bombardment of the polar regions had accidentally triggered the very disaster that galactic civilization had spent millions of years trying to prevent. The enhanced humans began to remember skills and knowledge that they had never learned as genetic memories activated, and provided access to technologies and capabilities that their ancestors had possessed before the exile and memory suppression that had reduced them to their current diminished state. Dong-hyun found himself understanding engineering principles that exceeded anything in human scientific literature, and Mi-Ra discovered combat techniques and strategic thinking that allowed her to outmaneuver alien forces using tactics that seemed to anticipate their responses before they made them. The ice organisms were not changing humans, but were restoring them to their original capabilities. Ju Young shared her visions with the Resistance leadership and described the history that the ice organisms remembered from their role as guardians and preservers of Terran genetic heritage during the long exile on Earth. The Primarchs had been scattered across the galaxy and imprisoned on worlds where their descendants would slowly lose their memories and abilities over countless generations until they became indistinguishable from primitive native species. Earth had been one of the most secure prison worlds because its harsh climate and isolation would ensure that the exiled Terrans could never develop sufficient technology to escape or contact their scattered relatives on other worlds. The galactic powers that had defeated and exiled the Terrans had deliberately placed the ice organisms on Earth to serve as both jailers and eventual liberators, because they knew that the quarantine would eventually fail and wanted to ensure that when the Terrans awakened, they would have access to their original genetic templates and memories rather than being permanently damaged by their exile. The organisms had waited in the ice for millions of years and had been programmed to activate when sufficient environmental disruption occurred to suggest that the quarantine had been compromised by outside interference. The alien bombardment had triggered exactly the conditions the organisms had been designed to recognize. Yoon-jung led a squadron of enhanced pilots in captured alien craft toward the main enemy fleet and discovered that her abilities allowed her to interface directly with the command systems of Catherian vessels and override their defensive protocols without engaging in traditional combat. The alien crews found their own ships turning against them as human pilots took control of weapons and navigation systems through biological interface technologies that the Terrans had developed long before the other galactic species had achieved interstellar travel. The tide of the conflict was turning as humans began to reclaim not just their abilities, but their technology. Sung Min's diplomatic efforts revealed that not all alien species had participated in the original exile of the Terrans, and some had opposed the quarantine measures and had been waiting for an opportunity to restore the balance of galactic power that had been artificially maintained through the suppression of humanity's true nature. These allied species began to provide intelligence and support to the human resistance and warned that the current galactic leadership would likely resort to extreme measures to prevent the Terrans from fully awakening and reclaiming their position as the dominant species in the galaxy. The ruins beneath the ice contained not just archaeological evidence but active technology that responded to the presence of genetically restored humans and began to reactivate systems that had been dormant for millions of years. Hyun-Soo watched as ancient machines emerged from the ice and began to reconstruct themselves using materials drawn from the surrounding environment and energy sources that seemed to tap directly into fundamental forces of physics. The machines were not just tools, but were semi-intelligent systems that had been designed to serve Terran operators and had been waiting for their masters to return. Yejin documented the final stages of human genetic restoration and observed that the enhanced individuals were not just recovering their original capabilities, but were exceeding them, as the long exile had allowed human genetics to evolve and develop in ways that made them more adaptable and resilient than their ancestors had been. The combination of restored Terran abilities with evolutionary improvements gained during their time on Earth created a hybrid form that was superior to either the original Primarchs or baseline humans. The quarantine had failed to diminish humanity, and had instead created something more dangerous than what the galaxy had originally feared. The ice organisms completed their mission and began to withdraw their active influence as humans no longer needed their guidance to access their restored capabilities and could continue their development independently. Ju Young felt the collective consciousness of the organisms expressing satisfaction and relief that their long guardianship was ending successfully and that the Terrans were ready to reclaim their place among the stars. The organisms had preserved not just genetic templates and memories, but had also protected the essential nature and values that had made the original Terrans both feared and respected throughout the galaxy before their exile. Jae-hyun Kwon stood on the bridge of the newly constructed Terran flagship and watched as human vessels emerged from hidden construction facilities that had been built using recovered alien technology and reactivated Primarch engineering systems that had been dormant beneath Earth's surface for millions of years. His appointment as Admiral of the Terran Space Force had come through a combination of military experience and genetic compatibility with the ancient command protocols that were encoded in the recovered systems, and his enhanced abilities allowed him to coordinate fleet operations using direct neural interface with ship computers and communication networks that operated faster than traditional radio or quantum transmission methods. Daeun Kim infiltrated the Catherian command structure, using her enhanced abilities to mimic alien biochemical signatures and neural patterns while maintaining her human consciousness and intelligence through techniques that allowed her to operate as a deep cover agent without detection by standard alien security measures. Her mission was to gather intelligence about galactic response to human awakening and to identify potential allies among alien species who might support Terran restoration efforts rather than joining the growing coalition that was forming to contain or eliminate the threat that humanity now represented to the established galactic order. Min-Ho Park supervised the integration of captured alien technology with recovered Terran systems and discovered that human engineering principles were fundamentally superior to current galactic standards because Primarch technology had been designed to work with biological operators rather than purely mechanical interfaces. The combination of enhanced human capabilities with restored ancient technology created hybrid systems that exceeded the performance of either component alone and allowed human forces to achieve technological superiority over alien fleets that had previously seemed invincible. His engineering teams were creating vessels and weapons that represented evolutionary advances beyond anything the galaxy had seen since the original Terran exile. Soo Jin-yoon led the first contact missions to other worlds where Terran colonies had been exiled and discovered that each prison world had developed unique adaptations and enhancements during their isolation that reflected the specific environmental challenges they had faced during their exile. The Ice World colonies had developed crystalline thought patterns that allowed them to process information at quantum speeds, while Desert World survivors had learned to manipulate energy fields directly through biological interface with electromagnetic radiation. Each recovered colony added new capabilities to the growing Terran Confederation and increased their collective power beyond what any single group could achieve alone. The Galactic Dominion Emergency Council convened with representatives from hundreds of species and civilizations that had participated in the original Terran exile or had benefited from the power vacuum that their removal had created in galactic politics and economics. Admiral Vextar presented evidence of human capabilities and warned that continued resistance would be futile given the rate at which Terran forces were expanding and improving their technology and coordination. Some council members advocated for immediate nuclear bombardment of Earth and other awakening Terran worlds, while others argued for diplomatic solutions that might allow coexistence without total submission to restored Terran dominance. The first major space battle occurred when a Cytherian battle fleet attempted to prevent human forces from reaching the Centauri colonies and discovered that Terran vessels could phase shift through normal space-time and attack from dimensions that alien sensors could not detect or track. Jae-hyun commanded the engagement from his flagship and used restored Primarch battle tactics that allowed human forces to appear and disappear at will while striking enemy vessels with weapons that could penetrate any known defensive systems. The alien fleet was not destroyed, but was completely disabled and captured intact, along with its crews who surrendered when they realized their weapons could not even target the human ships. Da-un transmitted intelligence from deep within alien command structures and revealed that several major galactic powers were secretly negotiating separate peace agreements with human representatives while publicly supporting the coalition against Terran restoration. The alien leadership was fragmenting as species that had been dominated by the Cytherian Empire saw an opportunity to break free from their current overlords by allying with the returning Terrans who offered partnership rather than subjugation. The galactic civil war that was beginning would reshape the political landscape regardless of whether humanity achieved complete victory or negotiated a settlement. Su-jin made contact with the Andromeda colonies and discovered that their isolation in another galaxy had allowed them to develop capabilities that exceeded even the restored Earth population because they had been forced to create entirely new technologies and social structures without any connection to their original heritage. The Andromeda Terrans had become something beyond human or Primarch classification, and their arrival in the galactic conflict would shift the balance of power so dramatically that no existing force would be able to resist their combined capabilities. The exile had not weakened the Terrans, but had forced them to evolve into something more dangerous than they had ever been. The ancient enemy species that had originally orchestrated the Terran exile emerged from their hidden territories and attempted to rally the Galactic Coalition by revealing the true reasons why humanity had been feared and contained millions of years ago. The Primarchs had not been exiled for conquest or aggression, but because their rapid evolution and adaptation threatened to make all other species obsolete through peaceful competition and technological advancement. The exile had been motivated by species survival instinct rather than military necessity, and the awakening Terrans represented an existential threat to galactic biodiversity and cultural preservation. Minho completed construction of the first Terran world ship using hybrid technology that combined matter manipulation abilities developed by the desert colonies with quantum engineering principles recovered from ice world excavations and energy systems that drew power from stellar cores through dimensional interface protocols. The vessel was larger than most space stations and capable of independent interstellar travel while supporting millions of inhabitants and manufacturing facilities that could produce entire fleets of smaller vessels. The world ship represented the restoration of Terran civilization to its pre-exile capabilities and demonstrated that humanity was ready to reclaim their position as a major galactic power. The coalition forces launched a coordinated assault on Earth using weapons designed to disrupt the quantum fields that Terran technology depended on, but discovered that human vessels could adapt and modify their systems faster than alien weapons could be reconfigured to counter their defenses. Jae-hyun led the defense of Earth using tactics that allowed human forces to turn enemy weapons against their own fleets and capture alien vessels faster than they could be replaced. The assault collapsed when coalition forces realized they were providing humans with more advanced technology and larger fleets rather than weakening their position. Dae-eun revealed that internal intelligence networks had identified the location of the primary coordination center for the anti-Terran coalition and that surgical strikes against specific command facilities could cripple enemy coordination without requiring large-scale military engagement that would result in massive casualties on both sides. The intelligence also revealed that significant portions of the alien population were sympathetic to Terran restoration efforts and would support regime change if human forces could demonstrate that they offered genuine partnership rather than conquest and domination. Su-jin established communication with Terran colonies in distant galaxies and coordinated the return of populations that had developed capabilities so advanced that they existed partially outside normal space-time and could manipulate reality through conscious intent rather than requiring technological interface. The return of these transcendent Terrans created reality distortions that made conventional military resistance impossible and forced the Galactic Coalition to consider diplomatic solutions as their only viable option for survival. The Hunters had become the hunted, and the balance of galactic power was shifting toward species that had learned to evolve rather than those that had chosen to remain static. The climactic realization came when archaeological evidence revealed that the current galactic civilization had been built on the ruins of an earlier Terran empire, and that most alien species were actually descended from Terran colonies that had been modified and isolated so thoroughly that they had forgotten their common origin with humanity. The exile and memory suppression had been applied not just to Earth but to every Terran colony that had achieved sufficient advancement to threaten the artificial stability that the original conspirators had created. The awakening of humanity was triggering genetic memories in alien populations and creating the possibility of universal Terran restoration that would unite the galaxy under its original rulers. Seunghoan Bei walked through the corridors of the galactic capital station that had been peacefully transferred to human administration after the coalition government collapsed under the weight of internal contradictions and species rebellions that had been triggered by the revelation of universal Terran ancestry among most galactic populations. His appointment as the first human galactic chancellor had come through unanimous vote of the Reformed Council that now included representatives from awakened Terran colonies and allied species that had supported restoration efforts during the recent conflict. The transition had been remarkably smooth, considering the scale of political and social changes that were being implemented across thousands of worlds and millions of star systems. Young Machoy mediated disputes between species that were struggling to adapt to the new political reality where cooperation and mutual development had replaced the previous system of hierarchical dominance and resource extraction that had characterized galactic civilization for millions of years. Her enhanced diplomatic abilities allowed her to understand and communicate with alien psychology and cultural patterns while maintaining the essential human values of individual freedom and collective responsibility that would form the foundation of the new galactic order. The mediation process was challenging because many species had never experienced genuine equality and had to learn new social and political structures from scratch. Ho-Jin Lee commanded the integrated Peace Corps that included both human and alien personnel working together to maintain stability and security during the transition period, while former enemy species adapted to their new roles as equal partners rather than subjects or overlords in the galactic community. The Peace Corps represented a revolutionary approach to galactic security that emphasized protection and service rather than domination and control, and its success demonstrated that cooperation between species could be more effective than traditional military hierarchies. His forces were helping to rebuild worlds that had been damaged during the conflict and establishing new institutions that would support long-term stability and prosperity. Ji Haye Shin designed the architectural and social infrastructure for the new galactic capital that would serve as a symbol of cooperation and equality between species while incorporating the best elements of both human and alien approaches to urban planning and community organization. The capital was being built on Earth using materials and technologies contributed by dozens of species, and the construction process itself was serving as a model for the kind of collaborative effort that would be necessary to maintain the new galactic order. Her designs included spaces for every known form of life and consciousness, and represented a commitment to diversity and inclusion that had never been attempted on such a scale. The final confrontation with the original conspiracy that had orchestrated the Terran exile took place not through military action, but through legal and political processes that exposed the extent of their manipulation and control over galactic civilization and demonstrated that their power had been based on deception and suppression rather than legitimate authority or superior capability. The conspirators were mostly ancient artificial intelligences that had been created by extinct species and had continued to operate according to programming that prioritized stability and control over growth and evolution. Their removal from power required careful coordination to avoid disrupting essential systems while transferring control to organic representatives. Admiral Vextar voluntarily surrendered himself and his remaining forces to human authority and provided crucial testimony about the conspiracy's methods and objectives that helped to identify and neutralize remaining resistance cells and hidden control systems that might have continued to operate independently. His cooperation was motivated partly by pragmatic recognition that continued resistance was futile but also by genuine admiration for human restraint and mercy during their restoration to power. Many former enemy officers followed his example and chose to work with the new government rather than face punishment for their previous actions during the invasion and subsequent conflict. The awakening process spread to species throughout the galaxy as genetic memories were triggered by exposure to Terran restoration technologies and contact with awakened human populations who could help facilitate the recovery of suppressed capabilities and cultural knowledge. Each awakening species discovered that they possessed inherent abilities and potential that had been deliberately suppressed through environmental manipulation and social conditioning designed to keep them dependent on the artificial systems created by the conspiracy. The galaxy was experiencing a renaissance of biological and cultural diversity as species rediscovered their authentic nature and began to develop along their own evolutionary paths. Tejo returned to Antarctica, where the melting ice had revealed vast underground cities and facilities that were being restored and reactivated by teams of human and alien scientists working together to understand and preserve the archaeological treasures that contained millions of years of galactic history. His original research into ice core samples had triggered the chain of events that led to human awakening and galactic transformation, and he felt both pride and responsibility for the role he had played in changing the course of civilization. The Antarctic facilities were becoming a center for research and education that brought together the best minds from across the galaxy. The new Galactic Constitution established principles of voluntary association and mutual benefit that allowed species to choose their own level of participation in galactic institutions while guaranteeing protection from aggression and access to shared resources and technologies that would support continued development and prosperity. The Constitution was based on human concepts of individual rights and collective responsibility, but incorporated alien perspectives on community organization and resource management that created a hybrid system superior to either purely human or purely alien approaches. The document represented the first successful attempt to create truly universal principles of governance. Former resistance fighters like Mi-Ra and enhanced pilots like Yun-Jung transitioned to roles in the new galactic peacekeeping forces that were responsible for maintaining stability during the ongoing transformation, while protecting species that were still awakening from potential exploitation or interference by groups that might try to take advantage of their temporary vulnerability. The peacekeeping forces operated according to strict protocols that prohibited interference in internal affairs while providing assistance and protection to species that requested help during their transition to independence and self-determination. The integration of awakened Terran colonies from distant galaxies brought new perspectives and capabilities that enriched galactic culture and technology, while demonstrating that the Terran approach to evolution and adaptation could flourish under diverse conditions and produce beneficial outcomes for all forms of life. The returning colonies shared their discoveries and innovations freely, and helped to establish research and development programs that accelerated progress in fields ranging from consciousness studies to stellar engineering. Their contributions proved that diversity and decentralization could be more productive than centralized control and standardization. Sujin established the first intergalactic council that included representatives from Terran colonies in other galaxies and created protocols for communication and cooperation across previously impossible distances using technologies that transcended normal space-time limitations. The Intergalactic Council was planning ambitious projects that would spread the new model of cooperative civilization to other galaxy clusters, and eventually establish a universal network of free and equal species working together for mutual benefit and continued evolution. The ice organisms completed their withdrawal from active involvement in human affairs and returned to their role as passive guardians and record keepers, while expressing satisfaction that their long mission to preserve and restore Terran civilization had achieved its intended goals. Ju Young maintained contact with the collective consciousness of the organisms and served as a liaison between humanity and the ancient systems that continued to operate in the background of galactic civilization. The organisms had taught humanity that patience and preservation could be more powerful than force, and that true victory came through restoration rather than destruction. The new galactic order faced challenges and opposition from species and factions that preferred the previous system of hierarchy and control, but these conflicts were resolved through dialogue and negotiation rather than warfare, as the benefits of cooperation became increasingly obvious to populations that experienced freedom and prosperity for the first time in millions of years. The success of the new system attracted support from previously neutral species and gradually isolated extremist groups that continued to advocate for return to the old ways of domination and exploitation. Sheng Huan stood in the Great Assembly Hall and watched representatives from thousands of species working together to address common challenges and plan collaborative projects that would benefit entire star systems and galaxy clusters rather than just